very interested in this panel, partly because everybody here has mapped this mental health and mental illness landscape in our own experiential ways. But many of us today, and it is almost becoming a pandemic, at least stress is, and there's a new thing now that it's caused because of vitamin D deficiency, which I'm sure it's deeper than that. And I have respected most of these writers here because for somebody who is trapped in what is called mental illness, either as a patient or as a caregiver, knows how lonely it is out there. And with that respect, I would like to start the session by asking each of our panelists and how did they, what is their take on mental illness? For me personally, it is a double-edged sword. Uh, while you are suffering it, it is hard and lonely, and almost there is no help in sight. But at the other hand, with my third book, my first book was Sepia Leaves, which was about living with my mother who was suffering schizophrenia. But it is in this third book, in this Punjab book, that when the state and what I was seeing in the landscape of Punjab really was bewildering for me, I somehow found peace when I started visiting the asylums there. And this was a huge contradiction, actually, because when you go to mental hospitals, you're supposed to feel what is happening there. But because that mental hospital felt so much like home to me, it started churning a whole different type of understanding of Punjab, which I depict in this book. But I would like to ask each of our panelists to spend 2-3 minutes talking about how did they map the landscapes that they have created. We will start with Gayathri because, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Aman, and thanks to everyone for being here. I was sitting here quite complacent, thinking, "Oh, my turn will come last," but no. Okay, so so I'll just talk about this in the two ways that perhaps I've come here or come to think about this subject. So the first is my memoir. So that's called "If I Had to Tell It Again," and I started writing this sometime in 2014. So it wasn't a book that I thought, oh, I have a book to write and it's going to be about mental health difficulties. It wasn't anything like that. What essentially happened was my father passed away in April 2014 from cirrhosis of liver after many years of drinking. And, so it was when you grow up with a parent who has difficulties of any kind, mental health or otherwise, you have a child's perspective. Many things are very normative. You don't think of it as something unusual. It is life. That's the parent you have. That's the life you have. Their struggles are every day. That's you. But then, of course, I was confronted with the question of grieving, and the grieving for me took the form of writing because I suppose that's what writers do. That's my space. So I found myself writing to myself, and not really to myself, to him. There was an unfinished conversation I needed to have with him. The things that I felt I never did in in his lifetime. It was a moment of regret. And while doing that, I think at some point I realized that this was not just a conversation I was having with him or with myself and my own difficulties a few years ago with clinical depression, but that I wanted to open this conversation out to many others. So then, and it is also the moment that the writer knows, because I write literary fiction. I've written 4 other books, novels, and I thought, well, this is the moment that I am crafting a life, and in this crafting is reflection, and in this reflection is sharing. But something extraordinary happened to me, which I'm really grateful for, which is as I was writing the book, and I'm a teacher. I teach at the Manipal Center for Humanities. So I teach in Manipal. And I was the student affairs coordinator for my center. And I was very aware of the students who were, for many years, I've been there 7 years, and every year, every semester, student after student would come into my room, and it's not just because I was the student affairs coordinator, but I suppose there's something about having inhabited a certain mental health terrain, something about it makes us, I don't want to say porous, but that is the word that comes to mind. There's something that was bringing these conversations to my room. And in the conversations, I realized that the kind of struggles my students were facing and the kind of resources we needed to really support them, and that we were actually abysmally failing them, and so I realized that there was something that I could perhaps contribute, even if it is just a suggestion. So it started off. So this is, sorry, just to maybe bring this a little closer. What happened as I was writing my memoir, which is words, and you're thinking, William Styron always comes to mind, because anyone who writes about mental health is faced with this one question, right? Which is, how do I describe that which all of us agree cannot be described? Right? Anytime I put a word, it seems to just sink. It's not doing what I wanted to do. And in that moment, I thought, here are these students. I'm spending hours and hours with them in the hospital, doing whatever I can do. And I said, let me just sit down and write down a wish list of what resource might be helpful for my students. And as it happened, that became an initiation point for a resource that we have built in Manipal since 2017. We started a student support center where there is sustained psychotherapy that's offered to students, along with help support from psychiatrists from the hospital. And it is, an initiative that the students, it's very student-centric, and the students supported it. So maybe what I meant to say, what was unique for me is that, and I know that I may not have this moment again in my life, which is that while I was engaging with narrative, I was also part of a project that was brick and mortar. And, there was a place coming together, and it wasn't just me. I wasn't just talking to myself in my computer screen, but there was the student community. And I'm really grateful for that, for that initiative. So to me, what does it mean? And I'm going to, maybe I'll end with this thought, because I've often, when I talk about it, and we say this, right? I say, I come to it as a writer, I come to it as a teacher, from advocacy perspective. But to me, all I know is that the last 3 years, I have lived a journey that is really important to me. And so I still can't put it maybe
No,
entirely.
that's fine.
But
That's fine.
thank you.
Thank you. But in that sense, Himanjali, your book is also looked at as YA fiction, young adult, and is closer to where Gayathri was. I mean, her students are a little older than yours. What do you feel about mapping the landscape?
Yeah. I think if I start by, as a reader, I think all of us have, from the, say you're reading a book like Jane Eyre, I'm just giving an example, but what really fascinated me as a child, even when I was reading, is the characters which were often marginalized, but say the figure of the mad woman in the attic, who gets very little space in that book, maybe 2 pages, but that's the character that really stayed with me. So I think figures that in literature which were dealing, which was showing this, I think when it comes to someone with mental illness, there's already that whole blurring of boundaries between what is real, what is fiction. And that gets further blurred as we write about these experiences. And so when my teen novel, which is called The Lies We Tell, that's about a 17-year-old boy who has depression and paranoia. And that came really not from so much of personal experience, but more research and just the reading that I'd done, plus people I knew. Of course, there were children I knew, and it came out of all of that. I also have an adult novel, Mrs. C Remembers, which is more closely based on because my mother has Alzheimer's. So that is a more personal book, I would say, because it's about a woman who has Alzheimer's, and I fictionalize that, but it's also my personal experience. I think,
That's fine. Shyam, as a psychiatrist who also writes, so you are on both sides of the fence in some ways. What is your basic way of articulating the space in which fiction or guidebook of sorts or whatever you want to write, how does that play out?
In terms of mental illness and mental health, It's actually a very difficult question to answer. What is mental illness is not easy to answer. On the surface, it seems easy. Let's look at a definition. A delusion is a fixed, false belief that's out of keeping with what other people believe or what most people believe. That's, by definition, a delusion. But, historically, for example, in 1851, Dr. Samuel Cartwright in the US came up with a new disorder which he called drapetomania. And he said that certain slaves, by virtue of this illness, are prone to escape. And he said to cure this mental illness, we must just gently cut off the big toe. Unfortunately, psychiatry has a long history of being used as a tool of oppression. In USSR, famously, if you were against the government, you were guilty of philosophical intoxication and the delusion of reformism. And you were put into a mental hospital and never escaped from there. So, and Galileo, all the geniuses have been accused of being mentally ill. But clearly, there is such a thing as mental illness, and I think we're getting better now as a society about trying to define it. But the problem is, in psychiatry, unlike physical illnesses, we have to go by definitions. In other words, verbiage is the diagnosis. What I hear from the patient, how I interpret it, and does it meet the list of criteria? Unfortunately, if you look at the criteria and it says, for example, the clinical depression has to have the person feeling a loss of interest and pleasure and feeling sad nearly every day. Now, the truth is that that's often a cultural, social construct, in that a lot of people suffering in our country may not even feel sad. They may not even know that they're sad, but they might feel physical symptoms. So what's important is to get behind the words and get into the actual flavor of what is happening. And I think that's why narrative is so important in psychiatry as opposed to physical illnesses. For example, diabetes, by definition is a blood sugar of 126 or and above. You don't need to understand anything more than take a blood test and look at that. But in psychiatry, if you reduce the person to the diagnosis, then you're, I think most good psychiatrists fortunately don't do that, because if you reduce a person to their diagnosis, you've lost sight of who that individual is. If I'm a doctor of physical medicine, to treat your fracture, I just need to know you've broken your bone. I don't need to know anything about you. But in mental illness and mental health, you have to understand the individual, and I think narrative is so important. So that's why for me as a psychiatrist and a writer, I was just talking with Roshan just earlier, and I said, look, actually, fiction is probably the best vehicle for the truth about the mind than non-fiction, because all those, you're trying to describe the indescribable. Even a simple thing like, if you tell me, you are feeling happy, and I tell you I'm feeling happy, what is the nature of your happiness? What is the nature of my happiness? We try to describe it, but the best people to describe emotions have been and will always be poets and writers.
Thank you. Roshan, yours has been a long struggle to bring up the book. So, what has it been like? And
Firstly, it's a bit strange I'm on this panel, but I actually didn't write the book thinking about it as a book about mental illness.
Roshan's book's name is
Abe's Endless Search for Satisfaction. It's in the bookshop. So I kind of started writing it because I wanted to write a book, and I didn't have any specific topic that I wanted to write about. But it just happened that I wrote about it kind of ended up being about myself. And since I was suffering from depression and anxiety, it turned out that the book, it's a strong theme in the book also. And to your question of what is mental health, I have no idea. But I'm just glad that I'm being treated for it. Thank you.
Thank you. Jerry's book is the most famous, M and the Big Home. And I have a slight thing to say, which I emailed Jerry also when I read it. And I said, I saw so many parallels between how I had written about my mother and how Jerry wrote about his. I would really love to hear from you.
When I got your email, Amandeep, and you said, what is mental health? My answer was, I wish I knew. Because if we knew what mental health was, we could do something about it. That would be what you call a map, like mapping the terrain. A map requires it to be something that Someone sitting there, third row, fourth bench, and I, and you, and Shyam, and Gayathri, and Nikhil in that corner, everybody of us would be able to look at the same thing and say, yes, this is where I am. And this is what I am feeling. This afternoon, lying in bed, taking a nap, I thought, I should be happy. Why am I not happy? And there is no answer to that. There is sometimes a deterministic answer. Your oxytocin levels are low. Your serotonin is not where it should be. Answers that don't make sense, because when you take an injection, say, or a pill, immediately you begin to feel, I'm relying on this pill to make me happy. This happiness is chimerical. I can't believe this happiness. I want this happiness to be naturally, spontaneously generated within myself. I'm relying on myself, and I'm watching myself, and I'm watching whatever happiness there is, and therefore it is slipping away because I have examined it to death. How can we know? How can we ever know? And therefore, how can we ever begin the process of addressing that lack of knowing? So this, according to me, is like the central large problem of mental health. I've just translated Swadesh Deepak's Maine Mandu Nahi Dekha. Amazing autobiography from the inside. Someone who tried to kill himself, recovered because of a huge amount of electroshock therapy given to him in the Chandigarh AIIMS, and then wrote about it. Having written about it, produced Maine Mandu Nahi Dekha, a Khandit collage. Woke up one day, a few years later, walked out of his house, and never came back. One of the greatest playwrights of Hindi, we lost him forever. We don't know what happened. His story is told by his son, Sukant Deepak, in the book I edited, A Book of Light. And when I was editing A Book of Light, I was asking people to talk about this moment when they lived with someone who had a different mind. Amandeep wrote a beautiful essay for it about his mother's cancer. And each person who sent in a piece, I would read them, and then I would think, my God, how you suffered, how terrible this life is, how horrible that this should happen to you. And then I would have to say to them, rewrite, get this piece in shape, because this is not just about witness, it is also about writing. That took a toll on me, because I had, normally when you're writing, when you're editing someone, you're peer-to-peer. You're saying, hey guy, listen, we both got something to do here. We've got to make this piece the best piece there is. But you are telling someone whose mother, whose daughter has just killed herself, or has killed herself, and she's writing about that experience, and you're saying, make it better. How can you make it better? It cannot be done, but it can be done. Because our only path into that dark, unmapped space is by being as honest and as clear and using words with great severity and control, focusing as much as we can with the improbable, inefficient tools we have, words, to tell the truth of that experience. This is what we have. This language as a possibility, a challenge to empathy, is what we have. And each time I asked for an edit, I was asking for that challenge to be met, and each one of my writers rose to it, and I want you to applaud their strength loudly.
Thank you, Jerry. Welcome, Anna. Her flight got really delayed in Bangalore traffic. But Anna, half of my friends in Bangalore go to Anna for therapy. It's really like that. Every second person I ask, and they're going to Anna. But she also wrote a book. She wrote a book with Deepika Padukone. Yes, she wrote the foreword of it. And I would like to know, from a very stirring experience of writing, which we will get into a little more after this question, as a therapist, how does she look at the space?
So I actually live my life on one philosophy, which I believe is very important to me, and that's about vulnerability. And in my work as a therapist, as all of you know, that the whole time I'm working with various narratives and various individuals, and they're sharing their narrative. And a few of them very often asked me, how would you know? How would you understand my pain? Because, you seem like a really strong woman, and life seems to have been good for you. Actually, for many years I had thought about that, and finally I wrote my own story and my own narrative, because I believed it was important for me to walk my talk. And for me, walking my talk is very important, because that's what I want to model to my clients. Because when they understand and they realize that I'm as human as them, and I've been through a lot of some of the issues that they speak of, that kind of builds an equity with us. What I do find unfortunately, I'm going to say something very political, among us in the therapeutic space, very often there is a tendency to, when we speak, to, in a sense, have a little more power than our clients. And I thought me sharing my narrative was to bring about equity, that I'm as normal as you, I'm as vulnerable as you, and therefore, for me, it was, I did not write about about my clients. I wrote about my own journey, which has been very difficult for me. And I've actually had to face a lot of issues after writing the book. But having said that, I think 2 years down the line, I think it is one of the wisest decisions I made to share my story.
Thank you, Anna. Uh, I would like Shyam to come in on this last, because this is actually about writing fiction and about characters, real or imaginary. But even to me, even imaginary characters are real, because uh, I want to know from you your sense of access and your agency that you give to your characters. Most of them are real characters in our lives. For Gayathri's case, it was father. In Roshan's case, it was he himself. In Jerry's case, it was mother. In my case, it was mother. Anna's case, it was herself. How do we draw the line between what we can say about somebody else or even ourselves, and how do we take rights to say these things to the world? And where do we draw the line on how do we cut out something in the editing stage of it? There are a lot of, and I would like Shyam to come in last into it, because you would look at it from the psychiatrist's point of view. But as writers of fiction, how do you feel about it, Gayatri? You addressed it a little bit in the last answer. But
I think that every writer, and this is, as you know, this is a vexed question, right? And there are many ethics around life writing that is all the time raised. Is this my story to tell? And questions like that. So I feel that each writer resolves or figures this out for themselves. And for me, I suppose one thing that I always thought was, well, this book is, by the way, I'm keeping it here because I'm very nervous. This calms me down. But I was thinking 192 pages, this is not my life. I've lived more than 192 pages. But, you choose, you decide what you want to tell, you craft it in a certain way. So I suppose for me, I think each writer decides for themselves. But as I was listening, sorry.
no, sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah.
I know, but each writer decides for themselves.
Yeah.
I want to know, how did you decide for your work?
Well, I guess how I decided was, and so okay, there are two things I'll say. One is that there were people very close to me who were not very much in favor of me publishing this book. And at one point after I had sent it, so initially some people had said, sure, publish it, and then changed their mind. And it went to the publisher. I decided to pull the book out. And I decided not to publish it. And I called the editor and I said, I can't go ahead with this. I don't know if I can live with myself later on, right? Someone telling me that I have actually offended their sense of privacy and space. And the editor said, it's your call, Gayathri. You do what seems right to you. And then I thought about this. And because I've mentioned my students before, I've thought about the fact that I've encouraged my students to speak, to break silences. And I thought about what would it mean for me to decide what are the silences I can break or cannot break for myself, taking into consideration the people who are dear to me, who I love, who matter to me. So what I did, Aman, was I decided to read it sentence by sentence and say, can I stand by this? Can I stand by this? And I decided that if I can stand by this sentence by sentence, then I can stand by the whole. Because you see, the whole, I have no idea, right? Because I can tell
Thank
tales
you.
to myself.
Yes, that is very important.
But I then took out I took out large chunks, and the stuff that I retained, I can stand by every punctuation mark.
Thank you. Thank you. Himanjali, how was it for you? And I really, really envy Himanjali. How can you be an editor at one of the best publishing houses and also be a writer? This has been huge.
Well, my books were written mostly earlier, and now, but I've written more for children. So the last two books I've written do have protagonists who have mental health issues, so to say, and both are very different because one is not from any personal experience, while one is. Because my mother having Alzheimer's, that is from a more personal space. So in that case, which the whole issue of what you're saying about how do I have the right to appropriate her experience, and think my experience has been the reverse, not exactly like Gayatri's, but after I wrote it and after it was published, I did have a lot of relatives who were really upset that how would you have published this, but of course I was hiding behind the whole thing that it's fiction, and which is true. I mean, you can't really tell what, like, ABC has happened, but DEF might not have happened. So it is all mixed up. It's like, I read this, I think Anne Patchett's mother said after reading her book, one of her semi-memoir, and she said something like, none of this happened, but all of it is true. And I think that works for a lot of fiction, and especially when we are exploring these spaces which are, again, blurring the boundaries between fiction and reality. So, well, writing about my mother's thing was, of course, it was about my life at that point was very much, did not have enough control. And I think writing is something that helps us to get direction, while in my life I'm not being able to control the circumstances or what's happening to me, writing is helping me to, I'm even if it doesn't have to be something happy that's happening, it doesn't have to be great things happening, but I'm able to control the narrative. And I think that's a very important part of writing, and especially,
Yeah, I completely get it. The need to control the narrative when life is actually swirling away or spinning around us. But what is that point? Like for Gayatri said, like if I can stand by a sentence, that was her criteria. I know what you mentioned about responses. We all faced it. But where is that point that you decide, okay, this can go, this has to stay back? Where is that in your writer self? Where is that editor self?
Yeah. That editing, I think I was doing as I was writing. I mean, there were things which I knew would be more objectionable, so I would fictionalize them in a way that it would be more acceptable. So it was a constant process inside me. So it wasn't, once I sent the manuscript to my publisher, that was no longer a question. I mean, they had to edit and get back.
The reason I'm asking this is because here is an audience which obviously is here just after a long rainy night. Last night the mud is slushy, but many of them would also perhaps want to write, and we often say as writers, oh, you start writing and you will figure your way out, perhaps like Roshan did, but what is it that we can tell them about where do we draw a line? I'm sorry I'm pushing it, but I'm pushing it in the Jerry sense of challenge, so.
But it is a very personal question, because where I drew the line will be different from where someone else will need to draw the line. It's coming of various factors which work has to do with my upbringing and my family and how conservative they are, or how open can I be about certain things. So I think it is a space that everyone has to negotiate for themselves, but it is very important to be speaking about these things, to be writing about these things. And everyone has to do it in their own way.
Absolutely. I wanted people to hear the ramifications of all that. Roshan, how did you draw the line? And it was a long struggle, so many drafts, so much time.
Yeah, there's no line, I think, for me at least. Um,
There is
and
no
even
map
if,
and there is no line.
yeah, I never thought of it like that. Would I be probably because I mean, writing a novel for 10 years is an inherently selfish process, and um, as a consequence of that selfishness, I never thought about how it will affect other people. And uh,
How did the writing affect you?
uh, wow, that's in terms of my mental health. Is that the question? Because it's a long. Uh, I mean, I can speak for a month about how it affected me, but yeah, I think I kind of just figured it out as you just said, and I didn't have a specific story or a specific theme that I wanted to write about. So I just wrote what I knew, and what I knew was myself. I was living alone. I was not the happiest person in the world at that time. I had decided to write a novel, so there was a lot of pressure on me. I quit college. So all this fed into my writing, I think. So the book itself became a kind of uh, not a memoir, but a kind of a testament to that struggle that I put myself through, uh, and that comes through, I think, in the book. One of the few things that come through, which is the suffering of the character, the loneliness, and uh, I guess the depression of the character, the main character. So my line is more about what a sentence sounds like, or uh, whether whether a dialogue works in terms of just, I think, just the aesthetic quality of it.
Could
That's
it be even ethical quality to it? Aesthetic, I understand.
Yeah.
But is it truthful or not?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's. I don't think you can write fiction without that kind of a. I mean, just be honest with yourself, at least, if you're not honest with anyone else.
Thank you. Jerry, that empathy.
I'm thinking about this question that you asked, and I'm saying yesterday imagination died and empathy died with it. If you can only write about who you are and you can only write about the story that you are ethically entitled to, then let us accept that imagination is dead and empathy is dead with it. Because you are free. You are free to write who you want about. You are also, therefore, when you write, and you are free to write, when you strip off yourself and say, I will be who I want to be, you will also have to take the brickbats that come with it. If you fail, if you do a bad job, if you open yourself to that kind of thing, take it. Stand by it. But take that risk. Because all of this is about risk. It is not about being safe. About being safe is writing nice little books in which there's daddy and mummy and two children and a nice little car parked outside and an aspirational level, and everyone goes happily towards a happy end, and there's a nice big dance sequence. You want to do that, and you think that will add to the sum of human understanding, of people understanding each other, of the growth of interest in each other and who we are. If you don't take a risk, if you don't go and stand naked on the riverbank and say, I can't swim, but I'm jumping in. If you can't do that, maybe you should be thinking about whether you want to be a writer or not. You should be thinking about it. Because this is where we are. The first question I was asked after my book came out, a friend of mine stood up and said, don't you feel guilty about using your mother's story? And I thought I had rehearsed all the possible questions that could be asked. But I sat there goggle-eyed and I didn't know what to say, so I retreated into the truth, which is I am guilty about so much else in my mother's life. that writing about her life is a very, very minor addition to that guilt. Very minor. And ever since then, that question has been asked. I have been answering it in with l'esprit d'escalier, the answer that comes to you. The answer keeps coming to me in different ways and different forms. And I'm asking you, I'm telling myself also, because that's a memory that I carry. We need to be asking the writer, how did you dare to take that risk? What courage did it take for you to say this? If you could say that instead of asking me about guilt, I have a way of talking about it. I have some way of answering you. But you ask me whether I have guilt. I have guilt. We all have guilt. But that is the human condition, to be guilty, because the standard we set for ourselves, for most of us, is always far beyond our limited capacity in the moment to be empathetic, understanding, gentle, true, honest, trustworthy, reliable. What a bouquet of adjectives, and how beautiful they smell, except when they are applied to the self, when they become reeking, horrible things standards by which we judge ourselves, find ourselves unwanting, and attack ourselves again and again, and lead ourselves down the path to self-hatred. Great words. So, you are free to write about anything you want. But they will stand up and say, are you guilty? Can you take that as well? Can you take the trolling? Can you take the bad reviews? Can you take the identity politics people? Can you take all of them in your stride and still create? No one said this would be easy. But they said, I promise you, it is exciting. Because when you jump into the river and you can't swim, your life is at stake. Are you game?
Thank you. Anna, you said something very interesting, which I often in my talks, I talk about the triad of the mental health space, where the patient obviously is suffering, and uh, now there are studies also of how patients suffering. And then there is a doctor or a therapist who has all the power to diagnose, to label, to prescribe treatment. And then there is this caregiver whose own life is completely taken up by the conditions of caregiving and often disrupted. And I've always said that I stand by the caregiver. And you mentioned that you wrote your own struggle to somewhere level this ground. I would like to know about where did you give yourself permission and where did you withhold permission?
So, first, let me correct you. I don't call anybody who walks into my room for therapy as a patient. I call them a client, simply because I want to normalize their narrative. I don't want to look at them from a lens of pathology. I think I agree with what I just heard from Jerry, that when you write, you have to also take the responsibility and face the consequences of writing. And I think that's happened to me because when the book came out, I have been putting it in a humorous way. I have been kind of excluded. I don't think I want to use the word ostracized, but I've been cut out from extended family and community. I'm not invited for any social events. If the odd one invites me, the rest of them gang up on that relative. But I faced it. Having said that, I think I've Every time that happens to me, I feel even more liberated, and it makes me actually feel even more powerfully courageous to own my story. Because I think a lot of the social issues that are happening, especially in our country, is because of the power of the secret. After some time, the secret becomes a living human being in your life. And every action and every decision that you make is including and keeping in mind about the secret human or the secret issue that you have to. So I think for me, it was truly liberating. And coming back to about the triad and the clients, I think what really happened when I faced this ostracization, you will not believe it. It is the clients who actually stood up for me. They have, I'm not even aware of some of the battles that they fight outside, but they do fight because that's the level of connection that we have. And I think it's very important for me to be real with them. You know, I think for me in my work, the relationship is most important. I believe transformation and cure is not taking place because we all have some techniques, but it's really that relationship that promotes healing. And therefore, there is not one day that I've regretted. I've come in yesterday because I've stood in a forum of 400 women, and the whole story yesterday in Indore was they wanted to know my story. And there are common links. We all have common areas that we connect. So I don't look at it as that I have to feel guilty. I don't feel guilty because it's my story. It's my experience. It may be right in the eyes of society. It may be wrong. It may be right that I shared. It may be wrong that I shared. But it's my story. And therefore, it's a way that I took ownership, and that's all that's important.
Thank you. Shyam, I wanted you to come in last because I know your books are in some ways prescriptive also, but there is a great deal of understanding behind them for the reasons you write. So how do you look at that? I mean,
So, firstly, in psychiatry, there's a long history of narratives, right? Starting with Freud, who wrote about Anna O famously and started the whole field of psychoanalysis. And as I was saying, without narrative, it's very hard to understand, impossible to understand human beings and their feelings. But let's say, as a psychiatrist, obviously, if I'm writing somebody else's story and I'm not sure, like Anna, I don't like the word patient. I don't like the word client either because it reminds me of being a lawyer or some other equally unsavory professions. Anyway, so I'm kidding. So anyway, when I'm working with people, right, and I want to tell their story, obviously I have to seek their permission because that narrative in the context of therapy is their story. And so a lot of times, say, as a therapist, I might write a composite, which really, hides identity but makes the point. But interestingly, right, I mean, all of therapy really is about figuring out what that person's narrative is. And it's strange how, in some ways, I think we go through that similar therapeutic journey where, we come to therapy with a lot of pain and suffering. And that pain and suffering is because of circumstances, but then it turns out to be because of our narrative of those circumstances. And then often in therapy, we realize that while when we first thought of that narrative as non-fiction, it turned out to be fiction. And then as a therapist, we facilitate the person's telling another story. And to me, true growth for us, for all of us actually, is to know that ultimately all of us are telling ourselves certain fictions, certain narratives. We all have a narrative about who we are. And I think the ability to let go of all narrative, can you stand here without a narrative about who you are, where you're going, what challenges you face, what your hopes and dreams are? Stripped of all narrative, I think is our authentic self. But we need a narrative to interact with the world, and if that is the case, that's fine, but let it be the best narrative we can tell, and that is the story for each person.
thank you.
There's to tell.
I have one more small question for each of us to respond in our own ways, and then we'll open it up for the audience, but not for too long because this has already been a slightly longer session. To me, the word is kindness. And I keep thinking of it and I keep reminding myself to fundamentally be kind to myself. You know, what is it for you, kindness? What is kindness for you, Gayatri?
Gosh. What is kindness? I don't know. I guess one knows it when one encounters it. One knows it, and one also knows it in the moment that one is fully able to set oneself aside sometimes, and all the things that preoccupy us and trigger our anxieties briefly, when we set that aside for any moment of reaching out, thoughtful listening, to me is perhaps kindness. Uh, I don't know. Maybe
No,
listening,
that's
reading.
fine.
I don't know. It's a hard question, Aman.
Thank you. No, be kind to yourself.
This moment is kindness. Thank you.
Himanjali?
Yeah, kindness is one of those things, not just to myself, to others. It's the hardest things, especially, if you think of in a school when kids are being bullied, everyone starts to participate in alienating people. So the kindness lies in how you stand up for other people too. And so it's empathy, love, all these things are what amounts to being kind. I think I can't remember who's the author who wrote Lincoln in the Bardo. George Saunders. So he has an essay called What is Kindness? And that was actually the crux of it for me, where he talks about how it's something that we all really need to work towards because it's very rare.
Thank you. Shyam?
Well, the only species in the universe or the world that has to ask itself this question, how can I be kind to myself, is the human being. Because we are intrinsically unkind to ourselves because of what we talked about earlier, whether because of our narratives that we hold in our head. Is it matching what's happening to me? Is it not? Is this what I desire? Is it not? So I think kindness means to set oneself free of all preconditions that inhibit your happiness. I think as human beings, at the very least, having won the grand prize of evolution, at the very least, we should have the same level of happiness that other animal species have. If anyone has a pet dog, you know that you give your dog enough food, water, and shelter, it is almost as happy as it's going to be. And that's the life I think we would all love to have. And it's, I think, therefore asking if we can let go of all of these internal commentaries and conditions that we basically flagellate ourselves with constantly. That would be kindness.
Thank you. Roshan?
Perfectionism and expectations are antithetical to kindness, I think. At least for to be
Yes.
kind to yourself.
Sure.
Do as you would be done by, unless you're a masochist.
Thank you.
I think for me, kindness is listening and embracing the shadow side of the person. I think we all have shadow sides, and to be kind to yourself is to be able to listen to that shadow self and embrace it.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes, and if anybody has urgent questions, yeah. And please mention the person to whom the question is targeted. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of general. More than just asking a question, I need to understand something. I can't understand when you're saying that one has guilt. Why does one have to have guilt about writing something or speaking something if you have a headache or you have a flu? Do you have guilt about telling anybody about it?
I think someone else's story, the question was, do you feel guilty about
No, exactly. If your mother has a stomach ache, or she has had flu, or she's had a bad time at delivery, or whatever, you won't hesitate to tell that story if you're writing it out. Is it that we in India have such a facade, and that we need to keep that facade, that we think mental illness is not like physical illness, is something to be ashamed of? Because outside of India, when you meet people, there are many people who just talk very openly about it. So I just needed to understand this.
No, I think that is culture, that is tradition,
So-
and I would rather consider it to an observation than really a question.
Okay, the history of the patriarchy is also and of privilege is the history of silencing. Just to argue against myself now. Okay, so the history of patriarchy and the history of privilege is the history of silencing. Men wrote about women. Men wrote about blacks. Men wrote about dwarfs or smaller people. Men wrote about everything and no one else got to write. That began to become the problem of guilt, or of questioning whether you had the right to talk. So this is also a genuine and authentic problem. It is a problem we need to face. I think as Gayathri suggested, everyone who is a writer is going to stand up against that question and struggle with it independently. My take is not Gayatri's take. Thank heavens for that. Because therefore Gayatri's writing and my writing substantially differ and therefore become part of a variety of writings. If we all had one answer to that question, all our writings would stem from that answer and begin to sound the same.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Hi, this is for everyone. So, do you need to be some percentage of mad to be some percentage of genius? Like, I saw this Van Gogh thing at the back. So, yeah.
The word mad has
Mad in the sense like,
unpleasant connotations, but I get your question.
yeah.
Your question is mental illness and genius linked, right? Well, I think genius, by its very nature, will stand out from the herd, and anyone who stands out from the herd is often seen as mentally ill. If you're too far ahead of your time, you're likely to be called a madman. All the people who were ahead of their time were called insane until years later we discovered they were in fact geniuses. That is not to say though that every person who is insane is a genius. As we well know.
Let me add to
okay,
that.
but I'll
If
just
you-
let me just complete that. There are some very interesting studies, for example, looking at a condition called bipolar disorder. And there was a very famous study where they looked at the biographies. This is all Western oriented, so we didn't look at Indian data. But people like Kafka, Tchaikovsky, etc., etc. And there was an overlap between what we call bipolar 2 disorder and creativity. Because when you're in the high phase and hypomanic, you get a lot of ideas, and when you feel low, you often are more in touch with some visceral feelings, and you can create and you can write down things. So the question then, the deeper question is it really a mental illness if it comes with all of these other aspects to it? And that's a matter of, I think, philosophy and debate.
It's not a matter of philosophy and debate. I'll tell you what is the difference between genius and insanity. It is, can I make money of what you did?
Van Gogh made
If I
no
can
money
ma-
at all.
Correct, but if it can be now made into money, then it is genius. If it cannot be made into money, so the person, if a child comes with her shit, which she has held as art, and offers it to her mother, that's part of a process. If an adult gives you shit as a gift, that's madness. If an artist puts shit in a can, and calls it merde de art, it sells for 87,000 euros. One can of artist's shit. Not a joke, actually happened. The last limited edition can was bought at 87,000 euros. That's not madness.
So
That's genius. So this term madness and genius, what you're judging as genius is actually part of a question that you need to be asking yourself. How do you define genius? Madness, yes, there is a clinical category as well. Some people have a problem. And don't ever say things like everybody's mad. That's to offend and insult someone who is actually going through the terrible, intense struggle of mental illness. It's not about that. It's about genius, that category, is simply whether you can be monetized or not.
May I just add, Jerry, this is really interesting, but if the person selling feces in a can, he's a genius, I would argue that the people buying it may have an illness.
Okay.
I think that.
On that note, with a small small one sentence. I think everybody sitting on stage here, all six of us, excluding me, I really appreciate what they have been able to do with the conditions they found themselves in and how they could turn it around and make them narratives. And I think that is what we must all aspire for. Thank you.